Good afternoon, I'm Ben Swan, filling in today for Steve. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a 15-year broadcast journalist veteran, having worked for Fox and NBC affiliates. Today, I'm the founder of the Truth in Media Project and operate my own site, benswan.com. Grateful for the opportunity to spend the next 3 hours with you, so let's get started. On today's show, we're covering the growing threat of ISIS, the militarization of police. We continue to follow the story of what's happening in Ferguson, Missouri, and we're talking Common Core and so much more. But first, I want to talk about the issue of police militarization. From our southern border to Ferguson, Missouri, we're seeing the militarization of police across the country. So is our state and federal government going too far? How about local officials? Joining us now is Armstrong Williams, a Newsmax contributor and host of The Right Side with Armstrong Williams. Thanks for being with us.
It's my pleasure.
You know, this issue of militarization, I was sharing with some folks. I've actually been covering this issue for over a year. It took about a year for the rest of the media to finally see this is going on and say, oh, Ferguson, it's happening. But this has actually been a long process, a buildup of militarization of police. Do you think what we're seeing in Ferguson for a lot of folks is an eye-opening experience, a shocking experience to see this happening?
Well, we do know from big cities like New York and Los Angeles that we can get crime and crises under control without the militarization. You know, here's what's shocking, I would say. It would make sense if this was going on in Chicago, if the military were there, the National Guard, because to me, that is a crisis. When you think about the fact that blacks dying at the hands of police officers only happens about 100 times a year, but black-on-black crime is about 6,000 a year, and you have all these killings that have been going on in Chicago. It's almost like Afghanistan and Iraq. You could justify having someone other than a failed, the local government has failed there. They failed the people, they've failed the trust. You can make the argument that is the only thing that's going to get that situation under control. Ferguson is a different issue. I think the problem sometimes is that, you know how you as a journalist, you understand this, you move around from Fox, NBC, and each culture brings about something different. You have to adjust. Police officers may move from New York, LA, South Carolina. They may go to Ferguson, Missouri. But what their training in Ferguson and the culture in New York and LA, in Ferguson, it requires something different than where they were before. I just think that the police misread the situation. They overreacted. They were not transparent enough. And I think because of their response to it, it got so out of hand. And then in the process, it started energizing people who already feel displaced, who already feel they have nothing to live for. And for some people, Ferguson, Missouri's situation with the police shooting and ultimately killing of this young man gave people something to feel good about, to bring attention to their plight. And so all of a sudden, these rows of people were coming in with their own agendas. And from all over the country. From all over the country, all over the country. And so when you have a gathering like this because of the response, then I can understand why someone can make a decision, but if it had been handled better by the police, then the military's presence there would not have been needed.
Okay, so a couple of issues here, because one is that with the militarization issue, for instance, we have MRAPs, Bearcats, these heavily armored vehicles that are used in Iraq, used in Afghanistan. They were brought home through these Department of Defense grant programs that have been given to local police. Is there too much of a willingness to say, here's an opportunity to use this stuff that we have stockpiled, these vehicles that we have, you know, the flash grenades, the tear gas? It almost seemed, as you pointed out, an overreaction to the situation. And at that point, how do you pull back from that and say, wait a minute, guys, we've gone too far, and that's actually inciting even more violence?
You know, to see those tankers as if you're watching a crisis overseas, because you're not accustomed to seeing that at home, I think that only escalates.
I agree.
And fuel more of the people that you're trying to calm down. Because then you begin to say, we're dealing with almost anarchy. We've gone beyond civilization, people who are not even civilized, and they need to be brought in control. And while they may see it as a sign of intimidation and force, it's just the opposite. Because I will tell you this, would they have brought those tankers into the suburbs and other areas? Never. And unfortunately, you would only see something like that in minority communities, where they feel they cannot control the behavior. But let me just say,
let me challenge you on that point.
But let me raise this point to you also. There was a similar situation with a police officer killing someone. It's just story just broke within the last 48 hours, killing someone who's white, in Salt Lake City, Utah.
Right.
Same scenario.
Right.
The residents did not protest. They
Right.
were not outraged. They handled it with calmness. There were no issues with the police, and it was just a different reaction. I don't know what happens in these communities, but I think charlatans like Al Sharpton, who goes in, who fuels the flame, feed the flame, and feed the anger of these people, makes this situation more volatile.
And there is legitimate anger in many of these
Yes,
communities.
yes,
There's legitimate distrust of police in a lot of these communities. I would challenge you on this point. I think 10 years ago, 5 years ago, you're absolutely correct about the suburbs. I'm not sure that's true anymore because the buildup of the militarization in cities across the U.S. has become so intense. Think about during the Boston bombing. We had, in Watertown, Massachusetts, we had armored cars, we had police going door to door, forcing entry into people's homes.
But what were they responding to? Terrorists, not
Correct.
their own citizens.
Well, but
there's a difference here.
But I'm not sure there is much of a difference in terms of the way law enforcement sees it.
In terms of symbolism for us, there's a huge difference. We're responding to people who went overseas and were trained by terrorists.
Right, but they didn't know that at the time.
Yeah, but that's who they were.
But they didn't know that at the time.
But listen, it's different, Swan, turning these tanks on your own citizens.
But they thought they were turning them on their own citizens. See, here's my only thought on that.
Okay.
Okay. The United States, through the drug war, we have seen the militarization of police as a result of the drug war. The money that goes into that. I agree with you that in minority communities, it is handled this way, but it's been handled this way for some time. The tactics that have been used in minority communities have not been used in white suburbs really ever until recently. But now we're starting to see it creep over. I think much of middle America is shocked to see this happen, but I think it's been happening for some time in other communities. Am I wrong?
Obviously, there's merit to your point, and you've got to do something with all those tankers and equipment that's just sitting there. And we're human. I could only imagine people who make the decisions whether to put these tankers on the streets or just waiting. Just give me an opportunity to show. We can showcase this. And all of a sudden, someone made a whimsy decision. Let's show the forward. Here they come.
Here they come.
It's like adolescents.
Yes.
They become adolescents because
agree.
they're so thrilled to move forward with it. But yet, they never thought about the deeper consequences of it.
Because
you know what? Because you know what? You cannot pull the bullet out of the chamber again. It will never be the same.
Well, and I think a lot of people in these communities had no clue, had no idea that when you're talking about all these toys even existed.
That's true.
So you have the MRAPs, the Bearcat, armored vehicles that are used in Iraq. They're being granted to police departments in Concord, Massachusetts,
I find
in Missouri, in Texas.
It is even beyond my comprehension when I watch it. I'm confused though as to whether I'm looking at America.
Well, because it's military equipment that has never been used in America.
It's confusing,
okay,
even to me, my
so
sensibilities.
Now here's something interesting. Segue to ISIS, because a friend of mine who's a source in law enforcement was contacting several sources about militarization. As I said, we've been covering this story for over a year now, this buildup of militarization, that a lot of people didn't even know what was happening. My sources tell me now, all of a sudden, that as of about 2-3 months ago, there are no more military vehicles. That all the requests for military vehicles have ceased. Why? Because we're going back to Iraq. And so all these military vehicles that have been placed in the hands of local law enforcement, state law enforcement, county law enforcement, well, now the feds are saying, oh, actually, we're going to need that stuff again. And so there's been a shift now to say, let's get it back so that we can take it back overseas.
But that makes sense, because you know what? They're not in oversupply. That's the other issue here. There's a very limited number of those vehicles that exist. And you're right, we are going back to deal at least we think we're going to go back to deal a blow to ISIS. That remains to be seen.
Well, it definitely remains to be seen. We're going to be talking more about that, but let me get your impressions in terms of ISIS. This is an issue where the president has talked about it, said no boots on the ground won't happen. All of a sudden now we have a few boots on the ground. A few turns into a few more, which turns into a whole lot more. The buildup is coming. We're headed back in there. Do you think we'll have success? And what does success look like?
No. You know, the one thing that we don't talk about in this ISIS crisis is the fact that the United States refused to arm these rebels, which was the right decision. They refused to do so. But the Saudi Arabia, remember Saudi Arabia? They were so angry at the United States' refusal to do so, they privately armed ISIS against what they thought was a threat from the Syrian government, and look at what they've created. They are the ones, and they alone have created this crisis in that region. And they can't put it back. And so The problem is we don't know who we're fighting, and the reason
we keep arming the people that we're fighting.
Remember this crazy argument almost a year ago when President Obama announced in Syria that they will have an alliance with Al Qaeda to fight what's going on in Syria?
Right. Al-Nusra Front, which is the Syrian wing of Al Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Nusra Front, but that was why when the president said they weren't going to fund or supply weapons to the rebels because the rebels were Al Qaeda, but we were giving them money and we were giving them equipment and we were training them along with Jordan and, as you said, Saudi Arabia. And as that training has taken place, the guys that we train simply go back across the border into Iraq and say, this thing's a sitting duck for us.
And when ISIS convinced the Iraqi military to abandon all the weaponry that the United States supplied the Iraqis with were left there, and it was like an early Christmas.
Right.
And those are the weapons that they're using. So, and even now, while we have our artillery strikes, our air strikes, who are we killing? We're still killing innocent Iraqis.
So we blow a huge hole into Iraq, which has already happened. The void has been filled by Maliki, who did a poor job, which has now been filled by ISIS, which is incredibly well funded. We're going to go into more of that later. Incredibly powerful. ISIS is there with $2 billion at their disposal. So we go back in, let's say we clear them out, we leave another hole again. Who fills it up?
We don't know. But you know the thing about it? The Iraqis must share their resources with the Kurds. That's an issue that we have not even discussed.
There you go. Armstrong, thank you so much for your time on this. Armstrong Williams. We're going to be right back after this with more of the Steve Malzberg Show after this break.